Hi, Frances. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
How are you?
Good. I decided to enter now since I saw in your email that
Yeah.
you'll be here preparing the whole thing.
Yeah. So, your fall semester been going okay?
Yes, as much okay as I can go with the whole online situation.
Yeah.
As you know, I'm teaching synchronically from Gainesville. That's what I'm living
Oh, okay. I
at
didn't know
UNF.
that. Okay.
Yeah, I'm teaching too at UF,
Okay.
but it's absolutely online. UF teaching literature.
Gotcha. Okay. So you did your PhD at UF, right?
Yes.
And then when did you first come to UNF? Is this your first semester or were you here last year?
Exactly. That's my first semester.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was. So when I was hired, I remember, I think it was July or something like that. Everything started to be kind of confused because
Yeah.
I had like every day different information about how the semester will be.
Yeah.
Actually, one of my classes, the Spanish conversation one that I'm teaching, it was like the previous week that it was decided to be up online.
Wow.
Because presentially was still a thing back then.
Yeah. Well, I imagine. Well, I kind of know that it must be especially difficult with languages. My wife has been teaching an Arabic class synchronously, and it's gone okay. But you can tell, especially with clarity of pronunciation
Yeah.
and relying on the students to have like a touch screen. It's pretty difficult.
Yeah, I mean, teaching that way, it reminds me when I was a kid, and there were these programs of learning learning by phone in
Yeah.
in
Okay.
Spain in the 80s, or learning through the TV. I remember when I was coming back from school, there was some type of like TV program in the Catalan TV. I'm from Catalonia,
Okay.
and it was called Open University, and it was basically some celebrity reviewing the material with you like for 30 minutes between 5 and 5:30 p.m.
That's so interesting.
So we're going back to the
I guess
80s
so.
in many ways.
Yeah, we need to get more stuff from celebrities, I guess. I don't know who UNF could get, but yeah.
Well, there were like singers, like actresses that
Yeah.
they are well known now, but not back then.
That's interesting. Well, let's see. I just made you co-host here, so you should be
Oh
able
yeah,
to share your screen.
I'm gonna try that thing. Okay, let me close the emails because they are doing that annoying thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how to tell the students that, okay, can you close the so if I do to share a screen.
Yeah, there you go.
So you can see. Okay, now.
Yeah, perfect.
Everything is going smooth. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, hopefully, we didn't do like an RSVP for the first. We did one of these, I think, about a month ago with Jackie Meyer from. Well, she's an archaeologist, so she's in anthropology, I guess. And it actually went pretty well. We had maybe 10 or 12 people, most from history or from her department. I did notice that this event got put on one of the emails from George, like the whole COAS email of like upcoming events. I don't know who told them to put it on it, but maybe.
Oh, I thought it was you. That's
no,
what I told you.
No.
That's what I told you. So you're gonna send the poster to Greg because I assume that you did.
Okay, yeah, I don't know. Maybe George. I think George himself might be on our list and just decided to share that. I guess I don't know, but yeah, at least from the past how we've done it. It's been nice. It's kind of a good, especially for research in progress. You get some of your colleagues, some people in other departments, get to work out some new material. So. We'll see. Maybe we get a whole lot of people. Maybe we just get a couple. No idea.
I'm absolutely fine with everything. Basically, I'm going to talk about my experience teaching terrorism a couple of times at UF, and one of the ideas that for me was one of the strong ideas when I was teaching the class, and how I want to transform that in some kind of like paper, because I
Yeah.
believe it's interesting. You mentioned that you have interest in the Middle East.
Yeah, so that's kind of my background for history. I do more North Africa, but of course we lump together with the Middle East. So I teach I teach the Middle East history survey class here, and we touch a little bit on terrorism. I think. Have you met? Well, I guess maybe being online, you probably haven't met a lot of people yet, but
Not really.
we have a professor, David Schwamm-Baird. He's in political science, and he does more specifically on kind of the politics of terrorism. But I do, touch on it for Middle East history, because even though kind of ideologically, I don't think it's the only important thing to know about the Middle East. For an American audience, American students, obviously they hear a lot about this, and so I need to address that. So that's kind of more of what I know about terrorism and history. But I'm always interested to hear more about its place in Europe, because I also study because I study North Africa. I do a lot with the French Empire. And obviously the French experience recently and the place of terrorism in their political discourse is something we have to pay attention to, I guess.
Yeah, I will mention a couple of movies actually because it is strongly based in film, audiovisual culture. That's my approach. So Jean-Luc Godard will be one of the names for the first terrorism movies in the spectrum that I want to explain how they became part of this narrative of what it means to be European.
Yeah.
And my conclusion is that if being European, it means to be a certain type of terrorist.
Okay.
That's my thesis.
Certain type, but not certain other type.
Exactly. You mentioned this professor of political science. I believe is the one that some of my students mentioned, because some of my students in Spanish, I believe in intermediate Spanish 1, they have classes about terrorism.
Okay.
I believe some of them mentioned that in class, so it has to be this professor.
Probably him. I think there's one other professor who I don't know, but I've heard mentioned before. But yeah, so David is married to Shira, who is a French professor in.
The one in the one who was the head of the department.
Yeah, a couple
recently.
Years. Not Pat.
Okay, no, the other one. Oh, I know her from the faculty meetings. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she's probably. I think she's on sabbatical this year, actually. So you probably won't see her a lot.
Yeah, she's connecting through her house in the faculty meeting, so I cannot tell.
Yeah. So are you? Do you think you'll be still teaching online in the spring?
I don't know. Actually, my situation is a kind of difficult as a non-American citizen, so I'm depending on the appointments between UF and UNF in order to stay here with my visa.
Okay.
And every day is a new thing. So 2 days ago, I've been told that there is a composition class that could be online
at
UNF, and then another day is that UF, some teacher assistants disappear, and then they need instructors. So it's going to be a situation like this.
So am I right? I just want to make sure I have your bio right. So you're.
I don't remember sending actually.
I just took what you had on.
Okay.
On the UNF faculty page.
Yeah.
So you're assistant professor as of this year, yeah?
UNF, yeah.
Yeah. And right, your PhD from UF. Okay, actually, I think I got most of it. And hearing you talk about your work, it seems like I was mostly correct about it. And your dissertation was looking at it sounded really interesting, actually. So the fiction writings of nationalist archaeologists, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean,
so I study Spanish nationalism in Spain. That is not the same as Spanish nationalism.
Right.
Through archaeologists. Actually, before moving to this country, I was an archaeologist.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So I decided to continue doing the same thing without field work.
Okay.
In a literature department.
Sure. Well, probably a little easier to move forward on research these days. Okay. Yeah,
But
I could see a lot of common interest though, because in some of the French colonial stuff I do, of
oh
course,
yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah.
this vision of North Africa as, the Roman Empire in ruins that we need to regenerate through
Mhm.
our,
Yeah.
archaeological study and so on. So,
Yes, Spain had a different, a similar, sorry, narrative, similar in comparison with France. So from the point of view of French archaeologists in the 19th century, when they were going to Algiers, they were going home because they created this narrative that the Celts were originary from the North Africa.
yes,
Spain
gotcha.
had the same story with the Iberians.
Okay.
I mean, you still can read Pierre Villain in the 1940s saying that the Iberians is a lost tribe of Berbers.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And being totally okay with that, because
Yeah.
basically he's copying 19th century Spanish historians that they say, okay, we need to send archaeologists to Morocco.
Okay. And of course the Berbers are not, they're not Arabs. They're not
Exactly.
Muslims. So it leaves room for like the crypto Christians, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I saw that I was living for almost a year in Algiers a few years ago.
Oh, cool.
In the capital, and I met people from Amazigh and Arabs as well, and it's interesting how the differences that they are aware of within the same Algerian society.
Yeah.
How they are more open to being Christianized, for example, or they are more open to be flexible with certain beliefs, and it's interesting to see how that could be a reaction of this European information. For example, part of my dissertation was identifying pre-Roman and post-Roman cultural assets, basically characters, because you, as a nationalist from Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, etc., you identify with, Gauls and Franks,
Right.
Britons and Anglo-Saxons, etc. But Romans are a problem, or they are always a problem, the Romans. And in Algiers, I saw a lot of books about the Numidians, because of course it's their equivalent of the pre-Romans. And even if they are like pre-Islamic as well, it was the only element of pre-Islamism that I found in the country. And I believe it's because of this strong connection with French European nationalism, basically.
Yeah. Wow. Well, there's a lot of overlap here then. This is good. All right. Well, okay. Looks like we've got a few people coming in. Maybe I'll turn off the waiting room now and let them start dropping in. Oh, I don't know Pamela Zeiser, but I think she is one of the other people who does some stuff on
terrorism.
On terror. Maybe I could be wrong, but I guess we'll find out.
So this is going to be a recording, and then you're going to send me the video or something like that.
That's right.
Okay, good.
Welcome in. We're going to give it another couple minutes before we start here, folks.
Yeah, don't worry. I have time until 4:30. Well, let me check again the calendar, because I'm checking the calendar every day. Since I'm not walking in a classroom, I don't know exactly if I'm in the right time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, for the millionth time, I'm teaching at 4:30. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, all the days seem to run together in a weird way now that, well, for most of us not coming into campus.
Yeah, and we finished right after Thanksgiving.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very early.
Yeah, that's the other problem I have, because I'm teaching also at UF, and we started here a week or 2 weeks after that UNF.
Oh, okay. I don't know why I thought that the state universities were on the same schedule. Maybe I made that up in my head.
No. I think we started in September, like September 1, September 1st or 2. Yeah.
Okay. Welcome everybody. Let's just maybe take 1 or 2 more minutes for people to come in. It's only just 12:15 now, but thanks for being here. We'll see how many attendees we get. I think the last one we had about a dozen.
Okay.
Chris, where's your lovely background set? I missed that.
It's in southern France. It's the Calanque, near Marseille.
Very nice.
I was recently told to start putting backgrounds up. Not that there's anything wrong with the mostly blank wall behind me. But the other day I had to, I was in some meeting and I was exiled to my kitchen because, you know, my wife was working in the office. So I had to put something up.
Yeah, it's
David-
funny. Sorry.
Sorry. I was just going to say that David looks like he's standing in the middle of a field.
I am, yeah. This is the Camino de Santiago. It's just outside of, I think it's 2 or 3 days outside of Burgos. That's if I move to the side, let's see this way. That's Julia in front of me, my daughter. It was a pretty empty path that day, which was nice.
It's not a Roman road by any chance. It looks very straight.
There are some Roman roads. This, I don't believe, was one. We had been on several, I think, the day or two before, but there are a number of them in that section. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's almost so pristine that it looks like one of those old Windows 95, you know, background screens.
No, it's true. Yeah, yeah. The blue sky, the green grass. That.
Yeah. It's one of the my favorite photos I've ever taken. It for all of its cliche, I think it has my daughter in it, so you know.
Well, we might as well go ahead and get started. You might hear from my noisy cat who decided to make an entrance at just the right moment here.
Yeah. Half of my students do that too. So
yeah. So thanks for coming, everybody, to the latest installment of the History Department's Past to Present seminar. This is our second of the year. We should have at least 2 or 3 more in the spring, which I think will also still be online in all likelihood. Today we're welcoming Dr. Francesc Morales, Assistant Professor in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures here at UNF, currently in Gainesville, I think. And he holds a PhD from the University of Florida. His research deals with themes of nationalism, republicanism, and terrorism, archaeology as well, in modern Spanish and Catalan literature. Dr. Morales has also recently been involved, I think, in some digital humanities projects. And his dissertation examined the fictional works of archaeologists, nationalist archaeologists, and their connection to themes of Spanish nationalism in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Dr. Morales also teaches courses, of course, on Spanish language, grammar, literature, and culture. And if your website entry is still is correct, also courses on Catalan. So I want to welcome Dr. Morales, and maybe since we have a smaller group today, and because he's been trapped in Gainesville during his first semester here at UNF, maybe we can all go around and introduce ourselves really quickly.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm Chris Rominger, assistant professor in the history department here at UNF. Maybe I'll just name people since the order of our images on the screen might be different. Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself? Oh, maybe frozen. All right, David, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm David Scheffler, chair of the history department, associate professor, medievalist. I also take students on fairly frequent trips along the Camino de Santiago.
All right, Felicia.
Hi, I'm assistant professor in the history department. I teach African American history, U.S. cultural history. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
All right, Cho.
Hi, I'm Cho Kelly. I'm an Africanist and historian of medicine and science, and I'm also the graduate program director and associate professor in history.
All right, Phil.
I'm Phil Kaplan. I'm an associate professor in history and focus mainly on the ancient Mediterranean world, Greece and Rome and the Near East. I'm also on sabbatical, so I feel like I haven't spoken to anyone in months. which is actually a very pleasant feeling. But it is nice to come and participate in these kind of events every now and then.
And your beard is looking great.
Thank you.
Pamela, who I have not actually met, but have heard a lot about.
My name is Pam Zeiser, and I teach in the political science department at UNF. I teach a wide variety of international relations courses, including this semester our course entitled Terrorism Today.
Okay, great. And Jeff.
So I'm a historian of early modern England, but most of my time these days is as an administrator in the Hicks Honors College, the dean of the Hicks Honors College.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for those introductions. Why don't I hand it off to Francesc, who has some slides for us, and we'll start with the presentation as usual, and then open up for some discussion.
Okay, so I'm going to the presentation right now. Well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to be here. It's very emotional for me right now. It's the first time I've seen so many historians together in a room since I graduated from the Master in Contemporary History in Barcelona in 2009. So it's like a million years ago. I'm very excited. And Professor Pamela Zeiser, I believe maybe you have students. Maybe we share a student. I have a student from in intermediate Spanish 1, and sometimes they mention a class about terrorism that they are taking.
That might be. So
yeah.
I'm teaching it I usually teach it in the fall, so.
Okay, yeah, I'm absolutely sure that that should be the case. Well, so what I'm going to be talking today to all of you is mostly my experience teaching a class about terrorism, as well as you do here at UNF. I did it for the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies at UF twice. First with focus in Spain, and second with the whole Ibero-American context, and mainly using audiovisual culture as the main approach. And I will explain now in a minute why. And through the process of teaching those courses, then I realized that there is something really, really interesting about how terrorism is portrayed in Western media, especially European media. And I would love to have the time, actually, not the courage or the will, but the time to finish a paper that I started years ago about this approach that is basically the terrorism as part of European identity. So I'm going to be reading a little bit. I hope you don't mind, because for me it's difficult to not be in a class and doing like 3 things at the same time. It's okay when I'm in an analogical situation, but not when I am in a digital situation. So terrorism is one of the most highly publicized forms of political violence. And at the same time, it is one of the least understood political problems in recent years. Spain is a place with a long history of terrorism that goes back to 19th century. And this issue remains one of the 20th century's unsolved political problems in that part of Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula, alongside with the territorial organization of Spain. That's, if you have questions about that, I'll be happy to answer them as a Catalan Republican. Every single form of terrorism happened in Spain since the 19th century. We have from anarchism to jihadis, through state terrorism, regional terrorism. I recently thought that the only form of terrorism that we didn't have in Spain was the anti-abortion terrorism that is quite common, or at least it was in the 80s, 90s in the United States through organizations like the Army of God. But I recently discovered that no, we had that too for a few years in the 80s in Spain. It wasn't the intention at the beginning, but eventually became an infamous group, part of this anti-abortion clinic terrorism in Spain. So we had all of them, eco-terrorism, you name it. Also, we have a bigger picture to consider when we talk about the exceptional relationship of Spain with its terrorist past, present, and future. I am planning to go further and claim that terrorism is in fact part of the European identity. To understand this, chronologically, 3 dates are the main cornerstones in the recent evolution of terrorism in Europe. First, the post-1968 violence. 1968, well, the 60s, but especially 1968 is an important year of understanding what's going on with this broader movement, usually called New Left. Protests everywhere in Spain, in France, in the United States, like Columbia University, Chicago 7, etc., but also in Prague, and also like Prague Spring, and also in Mexico. 1968 is also the year of the Tlatelolco massacre in Mexico City against students demonstrating. The other year is 1991, with the separation of the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. And finally, the events following the destruction of the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. When I taught terrorism, the terrorism phenomenon and its audiovisual culture in college, the first obstacle I had to solve is to describe what is terrorism to my students. At least that's what they usually expect. This is not just a purely academic issue or a political stand I have about how it feels for me personally, what is terrorism. From the pedagogical point of view, the instructor needs to be aware of the fear and ignorance populating the minds of the students, especially students accessing college education around 20 years after the events on September 11, 2001. I know that for, I hope all of us, 2001 is yesterday, but I believe it was like 1 or 2 years ago, the Modern Language Association decided to create a volume in order to how to teach 9/11 to students, because we are facing the first generation that was born the same year or a year after, or 2 years after the events of 9/11, 2001. Me personally, I was 21 when that happened, but I've been teaching students that for them it's a historical event that not necessarily are familiar with, because you don't talk about these issues. So when I ask my students why they are taking the class, the reactions are generally based on how important the phenomenon is, because it's happening everywhere. It could happen at any moment in our lives. Another common reaction goes to consider terrorism clearly an external phenomenon, foreign to a student society. So it's always something that happens out there, or it's coming from out there, affecting my reality. However, we have to face the reality many students do not want to talk about the subject. And it is mostly out of our control, the reasoning of taking a course about terrorism as part of language teaching in an American college. So they are basically silent when they approach topics like politics, or in this case, terrorism, for a course that they are supposed to be there to learn how to speak Spanish. And then they are expecting things like burritos or salsa to eat or salsa to dance. But then you present themselves with Osama bin Laden and things like this, and they are shocked. Boundaries start to fall when I present the genealogy of what terrorism is and how misleading are the terms terrorism and terrorist. First, the concept entered the political scene in France when in 1793-94, the terror was a key instrument by the Committee of Public Safety under Maximilien de Robespierre. In other words, the most simple way to see terrorism is a violent mechanism used by some group in order to impose political ideas to another. Here we encounter two problems: what is violent, and also the possibility of rejecting terrorism as a label by the group executing such violence. I mean, we have a lot of examples where, oh no, I'm not a terrorist, I'm a freedom fighter, etc., etc. And we have the opposite example too. People calling themselves terrorists. That was quite common actually among Spanish anarchists in the 1920s and 30s. I was a terrorist. I was the best terrorist of Barcelona in the 1920s, because that's basically the classic French Revolution definition. The solution to that problem could be found in the numerous codes of law defining what is terrorism. But then other problems arise, the most obvious being the undefinition of what is not terrorism. For example, it is going to be difficult to find a state defining state terrorism in its own legal system. I will say it's impossible. Also, such labels could be graciously applied to any political enemy a state could see fit. Osama bin Laden, Nelson Mandela, Arnaldo Otegi, and Greenpeace have all been considered terrorists by governments, media, and huge parts of public opinion. proving the single word terrorism explains very little and too much at the same time. It is evident I cannot bring yet another definition of terrorism to a classroom and then make the students work with readings, films, and papers about that very same definition. What I do is, in fact, embrace that complexity and make it work to my advantage. If, for example, actually it's a real example, I'm not imagining this one, a Spanish politician considers that the feminist protests are street terrorism, my job as a professor is to use his claim in the classroom because it is relevant material for a class about terrorism. Another circumstance would be if I was writing a paper supporting or attacking those claims. But in an education context, they are particularly useful because they trigger debates, avoiding the label game of who is who in the terrorist world. So basically what I'm doing is that if we have a claim, even if it's like as stupid as you can imagine, it's important to bring it to class because that's what part of the terrorist culture is. It's not just an objective reality that you encounter when you're walking around. It's highly politically created. I have taught terrorism with Spain as the main focus, and in a separate course about the whole Ibero-American geographical space. I use several points of view in those courses, and some other paper presentations I gave, like a recent one in St. Petersburg for a conference about languages and cinema and literature. That was before the pandemic shut down everything. Some of the topics are how law enforcement behaves, the female present in or around terrorist organizations, victims, executioners, the role of religion, forgetfulness, and forgiveness. However, there are two patterns always present in the readings. And by readings, I mean mostly audiovisual products, since I clearly see a line between terrorist acts and the spectacularity of the mass media. As Walter Laqueur said in 2001, the media, with their inbuilt tendency towards sensationalism, have always magnified terrorist exploits quite irrespective of their intrinsic importance. Indeed, central to the terrorist strategy is the access and domination of the media, as Benjamin Netanyahu already published in like 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago actually. In the last few years, organizations such as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant make the media. They are not just trying to appeal the media, they make them. Here is when the second pattern I detect in terrorist production enter in play. How European society justifies through media, especially in film, a division between our terrorism and their terrorism. So we have local terrorism and autochthonous European terrorism that we make fun of at the beginning, and then we're going to start to love it because we have another form of terrorism that we really need to fear. The other is something that, you know, some misleading young people was doing in the 70s. 1968 is one of the turning points of the story and appearance of terrorism. If we start listing all the terrorist groups of the second half of the 20th century, we realize there exists a connection between the failure of some political movements in the 1960s and 70s and the emergence of terrorist groups. In 1969, we have the Red Brigades in Italy. In 1970, the Red Army faction in West Germany, the Baader-Meinhof group. In 1970, the Palestinian Black September Organization, the Japanese Red Army in 1971. In 1972, a not well-known Basque group, Basque in the France region, Iparretarrak. In 1973, the Zionist Liberation Army in California, and from Spain, a lot, but especially Frente Revolucionario Antifascista y Patriota in 1973, the FRAP, and Grupos de Resistencia Antifascista 1 de Octubre in 1975, GRAPO. It is even more significant that pre-existing groups started a new life after 1968. For example, the Provisional Irish Army, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, was born in 1969 after a split in the IRA. The Uruguayan Tupamaros started openly fighting in 1968 after their foundation as a liberation movement 2 years before 1968. And finally, that's the most beautiful example, maybe beautiful is not the main word, but something like that. In Spain, Euskaditas Katasuna, ETA, existed since 1958, but their first kill was in 1968. They didn't start killing people after 1968. Their actions, their ideas, but especially their faces, started to populate the film industry with an impact and rhythm that surpassed the time of silent cinema and newspapers. And of course, here I'm just focusing in 60s, 70s to today in terms of filming. But when I'm teaching class, terrorism in class, I go back until 1912. That is the oldest example I found of a movie about a terrorist act. It's of course a silent movie about the assassination of Canalejas. That was the prime minister, equivalent of prime minister of Spain back then. This kind of terrorism was a media event, the one from the 60s towards 21st century, in a sense of both being widely reported in radio, television, and newspapers, but also being performed for the media. As Eva Mazierska points out, urban guerrillas, as many of the terrorists call themselves, deserve to be labeled television guerrillas. If you watch the movie The Network, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Actually, the success of a terrorist operation depended almost entirely on the amount of publicity it received. And we have examples of terrorist actions in the 70s and 80s in Europe, where the only goal of the terrorist group was to bring the cameras and say something to the cameras, and then they left. So it wasn't kidnapping or killing somebody for a secondary reason. That was the main reason. This was one of the main reasons, the publicity, for the shift from rural guerrilla to urban terror in the 1960s. So it doesn't help if you are still acting in the middle of the fields in northern Spain or some places in Latin America. You have to be in the city to be portrayed in the media. In a few cases, even non-existent groups have been given a great deal of publicity. What I mean by non-existent groups, we have a phenomenon, and the one I know is the one from Spain, where we can see terrorist groups that exist just in the media. And by media, I mean the police, the law enforcement. So since 1997, we are bombarded, like, especially in 2014, is almost every year, about groups that they exist just in radio programs, in TV magazines, like morning magazines. The last one is Blank Bloc 2020, this September. You can see newspapers in Spain, oh my God, the Blank Blocs, they are gonna act in the Catalan National Day. And I was asking my friends, what are you talking about? We don't know. and the Keeps that as a Posta Táctica in 2019, we had people answering in front of the national audience in Madrid for being part of a group that it doesn't exist. It's a common phenomenon that sometimes they even invent places in the police reports in Spain. Oh yeah, there was an attack against a policeman in that town. The town doesn't exist, but it's in the police report. And in Spain, since 2015, we have a law that it says that a police report, it has the resemblance of truth. Basically, that in summary, that's what it says. If you say something, the word of a policeman has more value than yours. Today, with the development of social media and its interconnection with journalism, it is possible more than ever to create groups that just exist in digital newspapers and Facebook groups. The movies from the 1960s and 1970s, directed by Jean-Luc Godard and Rainer Werner Fassbinder, show terrorist groups as few students discussing in small apartments, high intellectual ideas, and showing political naivete. Le Petit Soldat, La Chinoise, and The Third Generation are some of the titles where European terrorism was not just discussed, but also consolidated in our imagination thanks to the motion picture, often more powerful than the real historical event, if such thing makes any sense. It's not just the social media that we have today, as the examples I just mentioned, is that this phenomenon started in the 60s, 70s. So these movies, they are based, could criticize or not terrorist groups, but they create idea that, okay, it's something that still is there. It's never going to disappear, but because I can watch the movie as many times as I want. And that brings me to the poster for this talk. I believe you are using this image that you can find in Google Images. It's about the Gilo Pontecorvo film Ogro, Operación Ogro, in the Spanish distribution. The fascinating of this event, that is the assassination of Luis Carrero Blanco, the president of the government of Spain back then, 1973, is that never happened because it was in the movie, in the 1979 movie. But in every single book, paper, documentary, you name it, of terrorism in Spain in the 70s, 80s, they use the image of the explosion and the car flying away, as if there was a camera filming the real event. So the real event, as we say it from since we have historical paintings, whatever that means, in the 19th century, we create historical events in the most clear sense of the word, that there was nobody there to record it, something that we imagine 50 years or 3 years later. And this is the most beautiful example I can think of in the case of Spain. But I have more. In the late 1980s, it became clear terrorist organizations around the world will lose their most powerful ally, the Soviet Union. Therefore, the fight of those organizations was a worthless one, condemned to failure and worthy of mockery. Around the same time the Berlin Wall was falling and the Soviet Union was collapsing, two films were portraying a parody view of global terrorism. Under Siege, in 1992, with the terrorist character interpreted by Tommy Lee Jones, here we have him, is consciously making a scene when he asks for the liberation of comrades in prison around the world. He also is making fun of the overuse of the word movement, for that matter. A few years earlier, in Die Hard, we have a similar scene with the Austrian leader of the so-called terrorists asking for the liberation of fellow members of similar organizations he had only heard about in magazines. There is a wonderful scene where he's saying the names, oh yeah, we have to liberate our comrades from different places. And one of the fellow comrades says, oh, who are they? I just read about them in Times. I have no idea who they are. Again, in another comical scene, the hero of the movie, portrayed by Bruce Willis, protests when he cannot use the shoes of a recently killed terrorist because he had the shoe size of a woman. By woman, it meant, I believe, Europeans, because they are from Austria. And, you know, in Europe, things are smaller, like cars, for example. Both films emphasize how the post-1968 struggle was a lost cause. But mocking something still means remember that very same thing. By the time the terrorist narrative shifted to the jihadist threat, especially after the events in September 2001, European society had to confront a terrorist past still reenacted in media and, like in the case of Spain, still very much alive. ETA was dissolved in 2018, for example. The answer was a combination of romanticism and eroticism towards a terrorist past, but just for the local European terrorist past. Films such as Munich and the Baader-Meinhof complex played with the aesthetics of a sexy 70s time in contrast with a much more obscure and foreign Islamic terrorism. It's fascinating how it's not new, but it's exponentially increased after 2001. I mean, how many times we have European terrorists or something that it has to do with terrorism in Europe portrayed in this kind of like sexy 70s style. Like here we have the Munich example that I mentioned, Gal is a Spanish movie, Salvador Puig about the anarchist executed in 1975 in Barcelona. Vantage Point. For me, that's the film that's the one that told me, okay, what's going on here with the recovering of the 1960s, 70s terrorism in Europe. In the Baader-Meinhof complex, it's like you don't know exactly what you're watching. It's like everybody looks like a model in the film. And then is when I started to notice another thing: the recovery of anti-Nazi terrorism, because that's what it was, especially from the point of view of the German Empire. There were terrorists acting in the case of Max Manus in Norway. We have examples in Hungary, in France, and so and so. And then we have movies portraying this in this century, portraying how was this terrorism from the 1940s, because the idea is clear. There is another type of terrorism that is bad, is the one from the Islamic world. I mean, the examples are a lot of these examples. In conclusion, terrorism is a European invention, is a European problem, and also is yet another subject that coordinates our imagination between good guys and bad guys. The jihadists, usually portrayed unpleasantly ugly, are confronted with a European radical chic style that works in favor of a cultural distinction between Western European culture and the real threat of the Islamic terrorist. These days, last week, we are having in Spain the trial for the attack in Barcelona on August 17, 2017. Now the public can see the videos of the kids from a northern Catalan city, Ripoll, near my hometown, fabricating bombs. one of the elements that shocks the audience more, and I hear that constantly with fellow Catalans that they were watching the videos, is that they speak in Catalan. That they are speaking Arab in Spanish, and then they say so. Basically, when they threat the cops, they speak in Catalan. It shocks because many people consider them outsiders. That's the issue. Before committing anything else. In other words, not one of us. Catalans that watched Dragon Ball Z dubbed in Catalan language. That's basically the same experience that I had and they had as well, smiling and joking. And that's absolutely disturbing for a Catalan audience that is trained in basically what I explained here, the fallacy that we have good guys, beautiful, and then the foreign terrorists, they have to be ugly and speaking a language that we cannot understand. And then suddenly they say something that I said as well, that is to call the cops any slur that I can imagine in Catalan, as I guess, I don't know, 85% of Catalan young people did at any moment of their life. So that's for me the last example of how problematic is creating this type of narrative, where you create the fantasy of the 1960s, 70s terrorism as a good one, and we have a foreign problematic one that came to disturb, you know, the peace in Europe, or whatever the name you want to use. So with this, I just finalize. I wanted to keep this short, so I would love to answer as much question as you can have. I have plenty of time.
All right, well, thank you so much. Well, let's give a quiet round of applause for a really interesting talk. Thank you so much for that. Let's open it up to questions and comments. I think we have a small enough group that we can just sort of jump in as you wish.
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for a great presentation. It's always refreshing to hear presentations that talk about the sort of combination of research and pedagogy. So it was great to hear some of your practices in the classroom. I wanted to focus on something that you mentioned earlier in the presentation about teaching, particularly with regards to terrorism, teaching historical events that are unfamiliar to students, especially, as you said, events like 9/11. But I was wondering how you encounter teaching students events that they are closer to, that are more personal to them, that is indeed very familiar to them. And this is something that I encounter in the classroom when I'm teaching histories of racial violence. Just the other day, you know, we were talking about lynching, for instance, and two of my students actually had family members who were lynched in the past. So it became a very personal conversation. And even though lynching, we often think of it as very much sort of rooted in the past, is very present for a lot of students. So I was just wondering if you could talk about practices that you implement in the classroom when dealing with histories that are very familiar.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for the comment, because that happened almost every single week. The second time that I taught that course, when it was with the Ibero-American approach in concept. By Ibero-American, I mean basically the Spanish and Portuguese world. So Brazil was there too. And there was a day that they had to watch the movie with Raul Julia about Romero, the Salvadoran priest. And since I am a firm believer of demolishing American exceptionalism, I started to combine what happened in events like, you know, the army showing up to avoid people to go voting. Basically, they had several examples in the film that they are based on reality, and I compare that with the basically a terrorism that the United States suffered for decades, stopping African American population to go and vote, and they were shocked because for them it's another planet, the United States. So one thing is happening in El Salvador and Honduras, and it's nothing has to do with Mississippi. It turns out that it has to do. Actually, there is a scene, I think it's at the beginning of the movie, where the soldiers attack a bus. And then I show, in order to stop farmers to go voting in El Salvador. And then I'll show the same picture with, you know, the freedom riders to go to from New York to Mississippi, and then the whole bus is burning in the middle of, I don't know where, in Oxford, Mississippi, probably. And they were absolutely shocked because they never thought that there is such thing as terrorism. The terrorism is you know, is an ugly guy speaking a language that I don't understand. They don't understand that there are like, the KKK is basically a form of terrorism. That's it. They ask a lot about my opinion for the shootings in this country. I mean, and if that could be considered terrorism or not. And then I say, okay, if somebody is saying that it's terrorism, then I will use it in the class. But my personal opinion is that I need to know what's going on behind the motivation of that person. And I gave them the example of the Pulse, I believe the name was Pulse, of this disco place in Orlando. I don't know if you remember that. Yeah, there are so many shootings that it sounds like 50 years ago, but no, it was like almost yesterday. And I said that one was a terrorist act because the guy was motivating. Actually, I think he pledged, something to ISIS in Facebook, whatever that means, to him. And he believes that if he kills enough gays, so the society is going to be okay or something like that. That's for me, it's the most basic definition of terrorism. You have to impose violently your political ideas. And then I compare that with that guy in Las Vegas killing a lot of people. I said, that's a crazy guy that is allowed to have a lot of guns in this country. I don't know exactly what was his motivation. If we discover that he did that because, I don't know, he believed it was full of communists or something like that, that concert, then I will consider that terrorism. But if not, we cannot use terrorism for anything that moves to, and I've seen that in Spain, for example, violence against women, for example. That is, it's a social problem in Spain. And there was a moment where the Spanish government decided to use the state funerals again for women that was killed by husband, boyfriend, etc. It's a social problem in Spain, but it sounds marginal if you compare that with, I don't know, Pakistan or something. So the idea was to treat that person as a terrorist victim. And that's what the states do all the time. They use the label terrorism against, but also in favor of certain policies. So that a husband kills his wife could be considered terrorist. I don't know. If he's not part of the husbands against women or something like that, I will say no. It's just a patriarchal, misogynic problem that we have in Spain, and it's big and it's huge. And I suffer that in my home, but I will never consider my father a terrorist because he was beating my mother, because I am intellectual too. I can say it, and I understand that some people will say that, but that's my opinion on that. But again, if somebody writes an article defending that a husband beating the wife could be considered terrorism, and he uses the word terrorism, that goes to my class. I have more examples, but basically that's what I want to say.
Yeah, no, that was really helpful. I mean, it seems like it's more about sort of meeting the students where they're at and what terms they bring to the classroom.
The lynching, the lynching that you mentioned, and my approach with law enforcement, and that actually was my talk in St. Petersburg. So what I explain is that by definition, when I said that a group imposing violently certain ideas to other groups, by definition, all the states are terrorists. That's something that we have to assume. And hilariously, the concept of state terrorism is not applied to yourself when you are a state. Spain, for example, is a magnificent example of that. But it is in terms of imposing violently certain ideas. So then is when we think, what's the role of the police? It's just the occupation force of the state. That's the role of the police. I mean, the states have armies to invade other countries and defend the frontiers and blah, 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 and create citizens. But they have other type of armies that is to control the territory. And that army is called police. That's why we don't have police in the 17th century. We have police in the 19th and 20th century because of the creation of the state. So you have to be always aware about that. That is when we go to the George Floyd thing. So the George Floyd event was a racist motivated attack. I don't care what the cop was thinking. The police force by itself is a racist organization in the sense that that's what the police is. It's like, but you have to assume, even if there are good people, there is no such thing as bad apples, good apples that I hear all the time in in this country, it doesn't matter. Maybe all the cops are good. The institution by itself, since it's supported by the state, and also it supports the state at the same time, it's problematic. And we have to discuss it in those terms without being like irrationally violent or something.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to mention that George Floyd thing because it's a conversation I have constantly with colleagues.
Yeah, and you know, students make the connections between what's happening now and the past. I think that's one approach to take. Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
If I can jump in there, I just kind of following on what the two of you were just saying. I also struggle with teaching the definition and, you know, how do students view it? And, you know, of course, this semester we're online, so it's much less discussion than we normally have. But it's been really interesting in recent years to watch my students realize the extent to which, you know, what they see as hate crimes is in fact, or could in fact be seen as terrorism. And that gives them a new perspective on it. Sometimes, you know, particularly looking, I am blanking on the name, but the gentleman killed in New York City with the chokehold, Eric something, you know, that was an example that I taught in the past. This year, you know, like I said, fewer discussions. But it also ties back, Francesca, to kind of your overall picture. And I'm thinking out loud here. I haven't had a chance to think it all the way through, but the idea of Europe viewing it as our terrorism and their terrorism. In the US, I think if our terrorism is right-wing white supremacist, then the mainstream would never adopt it. You know, they would never consider it our terrorism, much less consider it terrorism. Mm-hmm. And so I just kind of find that distinction interesting.
Yeah, I don't know, since you are hearing from me right now, I don't know if you have the same problem, but one of my hypotheses about what's the problem that my students have when I teach those things to them is because they don't expect to learn that in a foreign language class.
Yeah.
They are like, okay, it's okay to do it in political science, makes sense, but oh, wait a second, to learn Spanish?
Yeah, no, I have a different set of students. They take it because it's an elective on terrorism. Mm-hmm. Although I have to say, political scientists are far too boring. I don't integrate film to the extent that you do. So I'll have to look into that for the future.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You have to do it because most of the things we believe, we learn it in a movie. Like, it's that clear. My students say things that is incredible. It's like, maybe because I remember quite well scenes and my students, I'm notorious among my students because I remember specific dialogues from films. And it's incredible how they say things that I hear in a film, on several films. They could say an entire sentence. It's from a 1990s movie, and they don't know it. It's hilarious. When I presented things like Spies, for example, and they say, oh, that, because one of the films, El Lobo, it's about a Spanish spy being betrayed by the government, Spanish government. They said, that will never happen in the United States. I said, seriously?
So I'm interested in the shift or the depiction of European terrorism in a positive light. Really, it seems to me a post end of the Soviet Union. You sort of mentioned that. Is that the case, that the shift is a kind of 90s on in the ways in which they think about or depict them in sort of less negative light? I mean, I think in the US, in the way that we think about the terrorists of the 1960s, for example, Madison. I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison. The people who blew up the physics building were sort of quasi, they were sort of local folk heroes by the time I was there. Is it just a post-Soviet Union kind of shift that you see, or is there something else happening?
So what I see, the representation in the media, and from media it goes to what the society believes, basically, is that in the post-Soviet Union, we have this like funny idea what it means to be a terrorist. I mean, if you watch Total Recall, like what these Martians want, it's like, yeah, we're freedom. They believe they're sort of Washington kind of thing. And slowly became this uncomprehended, hero romanticized, very beautiful. I mean, we have Richard Gere is an Irish terrorist in The Jackal. And then who was that? Brad Pitt was, I believe it was Brad Pitt. I also was an Irish terrorist in the 90s. And from that parody, basically in the 80s, in the late 80s, early 90s, we move slowly to a sexualization of what it means to be a terrorist. It is very, very difficult not to bring. I brought the example of the TV show Carlos about Illich, the Venezuelan terrorism. We have frontal masculine nude for like a minute or something out of nowhere, like absolutely out of nowhere. And this is just one of the main examples I can bring. Is like, oh no, we have to get naked right now before smashing capitalism or something. But the fascinating thing is that, and it works pretty well with my classes because I organize the readings and I like always to do that chronologically. So they watch the movies made in the 70s in Spain, where everybody's super ugly. Everybody's smoking all the time. They wear horrible sweaters. There is a Ogro. Ogro is a beautiful example. In Ogro, when they are making the tunnel to put the bombs to kill the president, they're wearing like the usual 70s sweaters. You know what I'm talking about? That thing, and they are smoking so much that there is a moment that it looks like the smoke comes from behind the cameras that they are filming, because in Spain the smoking thing was huge until 5 years ago. And then my students, when they say the movies, they watch the movies from 2005, 2010, 2015 about those same events. They started to see what's going on. It's like the people are smoking after having sex. in the 2015 movie, in the terrorist groups in the movies in the 70s, they are smoking all the time. Meanwhile, they are eating. That's incredible. And they are super tall as well in the movies in the 21st century. Everybody's super short in the 70s movies, because they are not caring about that. They are trying to portray terrorism under another spectrum of people, you know, few people trying to change the world, kind of thing, like Godard or Fassbinder examples. In the 21st century, post 2001, we have to do something, because we cannot use terrorism to everything that moves, because we have ones that they are obviously the bad guys, you know, Al-Qaeda and company, and then we have the good ones that they were those people from the 70s that we never stopped talking about them. So the problem is that we never stop talking about them in movies and novels, like the Red Brigade in Italy, for example. And so we have to do something. So we have to reenact what happened and then portray them in the most beautiful way possible. The anti-Nazi terrorism, it's super clear. I just brought 3 or 4 examples, but I think that every country has 2 or 3 movies, recent films about what they were doing against the Nazis. And they are using, they're using the actor from 50 Shades of Grey, and they are the usual scene. They enter in the scene, they see the girl is like suddenly in love with him, and they have to be married to pretend that they are a couple, and then they are super fall in love to each other. That follows a clear pattern, because you want to portray a certain idea of what it means to be a terrorist, because there are people that they are, wrong in their terrorism. Like these kids from Northern Carolina, it's like, why they were acting that way? Why is it still shocking? I mean, they were born in Catalonia, probably the parents as well. And no, they are not Catalan enough, because they are brown, or and then suddenly they speak in Catalan. It's like, oh my God, it's one of us, but I cannot believe it. I cannot believe they could be one of us. So we have to do something about it. We need more movies with naked people.
Cho, did I see you unmute yourself a few minutes ago?
Oh, I did. Yeah, I just, in many ways, this raises some interesting questions, and it reminds me of a graduate student's paper a few years ago, when she was looking at animal rights terrorism in the UK in particular. And then the shift after the 7/7 bombings in 2005, which was when the Hunt Sabs and these other animal rights terrorists basically declared that, you know, they weren't going to employ terrorism anymore. I mean, similar sort of tactics with the IRA and so forth. And of course, Pam knows this much better than I do as far as the IRA are concerned. But it's really interesting in terms of thinking about the us versus them dynamic when it comes to European terrorism. And then when we see Islamic terrorism. So even though in the UK, this was a homegrown case of Islamic terrorism, you know, it was perceived as an external threat, you know, a danger from outside, because, you know, these youths came from immigrant families instead of understanding it as an internal problem in terms of, you know, disaffected youth, you know, lack of opportunity, all of these other things, racism within British society. And so it makes me wonder, you know, in terms of thinking about terrorism as a broader problem, you know, there are common threads through it, whether we're talking about white supremacist terrorism in the United States, whether we're talking about, you know, animal rights terrorism, or whether, you know, I also think about, like, in California, the Environmental Liberation Front, the ELF terrorists. And so it's like these movements sort of go through these periods, but then when we see Islamic terrorism, then it's like these movements then say, oh, well, you know, it's coming from outside, so we're not going to engage in this because this is a particular claim to citizenship and to power and to a particular place within society. And of course, now we're seeing this again with white supremacist terrorism, as a way to retaliate against Muslims and immigrants and, you know, these perceived outsiders. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about sort of how that you negotiate these twists and turns.
This twist in terms of the outsider and the citizenship sort of relationship.
Yeah, insider outsider sort of dynamic.
Yeah, I was thinking, meanwhile, you were explaining these examples in US. I was thinking in the case of the Boston bombing during the marathon. I don't know if you remember these 2 or 3 kids, and they were like, "Oh, but he's from Kazakhstan or something." I don't remember exactly. They were like in the media that before saying the name, they were saying like they were giving us a lesson of Middle Eastern geography before mentioning where they were from, what they were their names, and that of course is important because it's the idea of who is able to be a citizen or not, and how we can use those elements in our advantages. And I will say that goes beyond terrorism. Think about how extreme right movements behave in terms of what it means to be a woman, for example. And it's so hilarious how extreme far right movements, they say, no, we don't want Islamists because we want to protect our women. And they use the narrative of the second wave feminism basically to attack another group, the group of Islamists, because no, you are foreigners. I mean, you are from outside, and we have to protect our local women. Of course, so it's not just terrorism. It's a way to use political problems that they are too big to encapsulate them. The genocide is another example. For example, if you defend that the Armenians suffered genocide against the Ottoman Empire or under the Ottoman Empire, a thing could happen, at least in Europe, that you go to demonstration to support the Armenian rights, to see what happened in 1915, blah blah, and then suddenly you will have Marine Le Pen next to you. Because they support also the Armenian was a genocide, in order to say, you see, Jews, you are not the only ones. So basically, that's the game that it's so easy to play. That's why I don't like to go too deep into the narrative of, to believe in the narrative of us versus them. I acknowledge that exists, and many people are using that. But I'm trying to be as flexible as possible. you mentioned the white supremacist terrorism. I like to go to the specific groups and specific people doing certain things, because you can I don't know how to put it. You can shadow many concerns when you use concept like white. The same way when people say Antifa, for example, it means so many things. I mean, we have Antifa members going to Syria to be trained, and or other stuff not. And the same with white supremacist terrorism. I like to go to the precise instead of like using certain broader experiences, because if not, I'm playing their game as well. The game of, you know, those kids from Boston, they were not Americans. These people from San Bernardino, oh yeah, because they were Latin American, blah blah. And then you reduce what it means to be an American citizen. It's the same in Europe as well. I assume in England as well. So for me, it's so important to, the same way that I don't like to use a strong definition of what it means to terrorism. I like to go to specific people, specific groups, and specific situations as well. It's not the same ETA now that ETA, well, now it doesn't exist. ETA 5 years ago that ETA 50 years ago. Although the Spanish media try to sell you that it's exactly the same thing. So that's my approach to that. Like, for example, if I want to talk about white terrorist organizations in the United States, I cannot put together Proud Boys and KKK, especially which one of the KKKs, the one from the 19th century, the one from the 1920s, the one from Canada that tried to invade Grenada in the 1980s. That's the hilarious moments in the history of KKK. So I try to go in detail of what's going on. And again, because if not, I'm playing the game, and it's so easy to play the game.
So I wanted to add a couple examples of where I've seen some of this slippage recently here. I don't know that anybody is calling the protests this year terrorism, but there is clearly a sort of a strain in on the right in the United States to terrorize people about what, you know, sort of the worst imagination, the worst case scenario could be. And what's been very interesting about this insider-outsider thing is, including here in Florida, legislators, governors, and mayors engaging in this discourse of the protesters who are from out of state are the problem, right? It's because no real citizen of you know, Minneapolis, or no real Floridian would do this to their own community. And so we're going to make sure that if you cross state lines to participate in a protest, that's the real problem, right? No, so that's sort of one place where I've seen it. The other place I've seen it is in the sort of liberal outlets, the outrage that you know, white supremacists, for example, are not being labeled domestic terrorists. And it sort of strikes me that there's even this emphasis on the word domestic there, right? Well, what really is the difference between a domestic terrorist and a terrorist? Which tells you, of course, that terrorist in our minds is, as you say, it's foreign. There's something foreign about it. To the point where, in some cases, even those on the left demand that we call the white terrorists domestic terrorists. So I don't know. There's not really a question there.
Thank you, because I'm thinking more examples from the previous question about the inside out and how easy it is to manipulate certain messages that they have good intentions. And I mentioned in my presentation how ISIS, the Islamic State, it's the media. Now not as much because, you know, because bombs basically, but in 2014, 2015, it was huge. I mean, they had dozens of producer companies. So what do you think the material came from? So basically they used the movies that we watched, the video games we played, the comic books, the experience. I mean, have you ever checked recently a commercial of Taco Bell or Burger King? you are not going to Taco Bell or Burger King, you're going to a mission to do something. So they use these examples of, oh, we're going to make videos to recruit people, and because we are programmed to understand what's going on. So that's how smart they were, the people in ISIS. I show my students one of the first propaganda videos by ISIS, the No Respite. I highly recommend. It's one of the few that it's possible to find without going to dark web, and it's incredible because they show everything they say is true. It's like my students, they were like, oh my God, yeah, it's true. The veterans in the United States, they commit suicide in that rating. So why are you coming to our country with a bullet that costs like 50 cents? I can stop you, and you spend a lot of money to bring people into Iraq and Syria. And you are from a country that is super racist, United States, we love each other. And then they showed like United Colors of Benetton kind of thing, like people from the whole like, a kaleidoscope of colors being together because they are Muslims, and so it's like, oh, sounds like a good idea. Let's go. And my students, they were like, I said, wait a second, try not to be programmed and go to ISIS, because then I will have to fill a lot of paperwork for that. But they were shocked about how good they were selling the message. I mean, when I showed them videos, I did that too. How ISIS was teaching how to make a bomb, for example. And they were using a kitchen scene, something that you are familiar to see, because we have a lot of reality shows based on cooking where the chefs, they look like ninjas and everybody's upset and yelling, and because it's another form of military service to go to a reality show of cooking. The interconnection is super clear, especially in Spain. It's awesome. It's just another way to sell national Catholicism in Spain, the reality shows about cooking. So ISIS is doing the same. So you have a guy with a mask and everything, and it's showing in the kitchen was like in pollute. You have to mix this to kill the infidel, blah blah. And my students were like, oh my God, I understood perfectly what he said in French, but the subtitles were in English. But I understood perfectly because he was touching the products that he was explaining, as a good chef in TV will say. So they copy these elements that they are, let's say, positive, or they are well made in order to sell their messages. That's what happened after the attack in Barcelona in 2017. They made a video like the next day, and it looks like a super catchy video clip of French hip hop music. And what they use, a collage of scenes from different TV news anchors in the United States, Latin America, and Europe. The terror is trapping again Barcelona, and they're like with hip hop in the background. I say, oh my God, I want to join these guys. Like they know what they're doing. It looks cool, and that's why it's so necessary for me to go to deep in details of what's going on in the specific situations. Because if we go to broader explanations of things like Antifa, white supremacy, etc., we are playing their game, and it's so easy, so easy.
Can I jump in? And I wanted to follow up a bit on your interesting discussion on sort of using media to sort of project terrorism, but to take it back to state terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, which you only briefly touched on. It's particularly interesting to me because as a pre-modernist, it's very hard to find phenomena that are congruent with terrorism as we generally think of it.
Uh-oh, have we lost Phil here? Let's give it a second. Maybe he'll come back.
The image disappeared too, for me at least.
Oh well. Sorry, Phil. We'll come back to you when you come back to us. Any other questions or comments at the moment?
This is a little, not entirely tangential, but connects with my interest in the iconography of the Camino. I think after the Madrid bombings in 2004, there was some internal debate in Spain about the appropriateness of the image of Santiago Matamoros as a sort of both religious and cultural symbol. I was wondering if that was something that you have sort of thought about, talked about, dealt with in your work.
Yeah, I taught that in class. So in Spain, and that's how the societies are built. We are built on beautiful things and horrible things, and you have to accept it, and that's it, and move on. You can modify that, but you don't need to feel bad about certain things. So the iconography about Santiago Matamoros is one of the many examples of problematic icons we have in Spain. We had a town until 2014, 15, 16, that the name was Mata Judíos, Jew killer. That was the name of the town. It's like, where you were born? In Jew killer. That's my address, basically. And then they changed it for Castro, Mota, blah, blah. They changed the name, but for centuries, that was the name of the town because the past we have in Spain against Judaism. And in Catalan language, for example, when you clean a house, when you deeply clean a house, the only expression we have in Catalan language, it's fer dissabte, to do the Sabbath. Why? Because you show to your neighbors that you are not Jew. So you are working a lot in a Saturday, and I'm totally programmed. It's when I clean my house still today. Like, oh, it's Saturday, I have to clean the house because I cannot let the Spanish Inquisition come to catch me. So it's basically this program. The famous, and I'm sure that you're familiar with this product, ensaimada, that's common in Mallorca. I don't know if you hear ensaimada. Originally, saim is the old Catalan word for pork fat. So basically, you are eating this, you are not a Jew. That's why we kill pork in public in Spain. And the word for dude, like guy, like the common one, the super common one in Catalan language is payo. Payo means non-gypsy. So basically, we call each other, oh, you are not gypsy. So, well, originally it means farmer, but it means non-gypsy. So we have so many, and Santiago Matamoros is just the last one. And I'm going to mention one that is probably is going to shock you. But we have, what's the name of these museums that you have here in America? The wonderful thing, marvelous, with bizarre things. There is a chain.
Ripley's, believe it or not.
Ripley's, believe it or not. So next to my hometown, we have the real deal. So 19th century, early 20th century, crazy zoological museum with, goat with 3 heads, these kind of things. So I was regularly visiting this museum as a kid when I was in elementary school, like 2 or 3 times, like all the classmates in basically Catalonia, honestly, in the 80s, 90s, early 90s. So one of the things that this museum had, it was a Black African taxidermist. So taxidermized, so a human being next to a lion and next to a goat with 3 heads in a capsule. Okay, nobody found that problematic until 1992. We have the Olympic Games of Barcelona, Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations, and immigration from Africa. And then somebody said, oh my God, you have a Black person in a museum, and the kids, they go there and visit it. And then is when we thought, oh my God, it's true, until somebody said it. I never thought it was problematic, never in my life. I mean, we have postcards. El negro de Bañolas was the expression. It is still the expression that we use for referring to that person. Now the remains are in Botswana. But in 1992, it was like when we discovered that we had a Black person in a museum. And examples like these are everywhere. But Spain, I'm assuming it's not the only one. But yeah, Santiago Matamoros is like the last of our problems. Because in America it became Santiago Mata Indios too. But yeah, the case of the El Negro de Bañolas, it was incredible because it was like, and of course, when how these human remains entered to Spain, they entered as fauna because it was like an animal when the remains came from Africa to the museum next to my town in 1905 or something like that. That's what the label says, fauna, because it wasn't a human being. We still have human zoos until the 1950s in Europe, in Belgium. Yeah, Spain has a lot of stories like this. Let's see, Dr. Capo.
Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Phil, do you want to try again?
Sorry, I just briefly repeat what I was trying to say. I have an unstable internet connection. It was simply like, do you deal with the phenomenon of state-sponsored terrorism and specifically the use of media to extend its force. Like my general sense is that what we think of as state-sponsored terrorism tends to get downplayed or underplayed because states don't want to publicly admit that they are promoting terror against either their own population or other populations. But maybe you know other examples, or maybe you know examples that are sort of congruent where states are playing up their brutality in order to sort of extend their reach in a sense.
Well, as I said before, by definition, all the states are terrorists. That's just a reality we have to face too, because it's the new form of how the human beings are organized in the 19th century. That's why we don't have terrorism in the 14th century. I mean, somebody could call, let's go kill all the I don't know, people with some certain disease in the 14th century France, and we can call that terrorism. Yeah, you can call terrorism anything you want. But for me, it's so clear that it's connected with the creation of the state, and how the different groups are playing power games, and the state is the main the main player, basically. I mean, things like ETA or Tupamaros in whatever, those are anecdotes that exist mainly in media and movies and theater plays. The big terrorist sponsor are the state. They are the ones fabricating guns. They are the ones moving the money or allowing moving the money. That's why in the Soviet Union is so important. When the Soviet Union disappears, or is clearly that's going to disappear, is when we start to see, all these groups, they're going to lose their support. And that's exactly what happened, because they were depending on money from the Soviet Union. ISIS, when ISIS was taking over the petrol areas in certain parts of North Iraq and East Syria, they were selling that oil. They were selling. The media portrayed like these barbarians smashing figures in whatever museum in Baghdad or in Afghanistan or whatever, in the case of the Taliban. But in reality, they were selling those things through eBay to make money. And the governments are involved in all this. All these terrorist groups that I mentioned, invented by the media in Spain, I repeat, they were invented in the media using police reports, because it's the same thing. Yeah, just in the case of Spain, it's very, very difficult to see a difference between an independent media. I know that probably you as Americans, you believe that you don't have independent media because you have Fox and whatever. It's a joke in comparison with what we have in countries like Spain, where basically there are things that they are not able to say. I'm going to put the example of my mother. A few weeks ago, I gave a talk about the Catalan conflict for the UF, the Center for European Studies at UF, and I showed the video to my mother. And then she said, "Oh, wow, so in America, you could say those things? Be careful, because are you sure it's not like in Spain that you can go to jail if you speak bad about the government?" She assumes that that's a reality, but because that's what's going on in Spain for a long time. Basically, the dictatorship continued with another form called democracy. And that's why state terrorism is not going to be applied to whatever act you are creating. Spain in the 80s hired Portuguese and French mercenaries to kill French citizens in French soil because they considered they were ETA, using money, like public money, what is called reserve money, that we have no control, democratically speaking. And there was a trial about that. In the trial, if you read the sentence, it never says state terrorism. It's just a group with guns organized magically by blah, blah, blah. That's what they do all the time. That's why you have the infiltration, Counter-Pro, something like, what was the thing that the FBI was doing here? Counter something. Everybody, Counter-Pro. So that's what the Spain had been doing for decades, like infiltrating groups or creating groups, like Milicia Catalana, for example. Milicia Catalana is that one that I mentioned that it was an anti-abortist group. It was created to target independentist Catalan politicians. And which type of people you're going to recruit for that? You're going to recruit extreme right-wing cops and extreme right-wing people in general. And of course, they have also ideas of being super religious and anti-abortion and anti-gay. So they were attacking, yes, bars known for having independentist politicians there in Catalonia, but also they use the money for, a side job, like putting bombs in clinics that they were known for making abortions in the early 80s. And actually, that group stopped because there was an explosion in Barcelona in 1983 or 84. And when the firefighters show up, they saw a dead cop. Of course, he was making the bomb, and then the bomb exploded in his hands. And then Militia Catalana disappeared magically. That's happening all the time. And we have to understand this reality, that the states are not oblivious to that. When we have a lot of information about a certain group, is because that group is out of control. It's the case of ISIS. In the case of ISIS, we saw clearly how all the players in the Syria area, they stopped killing each other because they had a bigger enemy, ISIS, and then they started to basically hammer ISIS positions with the help of Turkish soldiers together with some Peshmerga militias and bombs from Obama administration. And then when ISIS was under control, the Turkish troops invaded again Kurdistan, because okay, now we can come back to the real politic of everyday life in that part of the world. ISIS was too a threat because it was a state by itself. That's the I was about to say the beauty of ISIS, but something like that. The magnificent idea of ISIS representing as a threat to the world, because it was totally out of control. So to answer the question, yeah, I deal with the state terrorism. The students usually are shocked, and most of my colleagues, they don't like it, especially if they are from Spain, because it's problematic. You don't believe that a government could do certain things. Yeah, that's all the time.
Sorry, the garbage truck picked a good time to roll right up next to my window here. I was going to add only one other thing, which is I think for students, it's also useful when you're talking about state terrorism, is to remind them that it's not always the case that states are deliberately creating terror, but when the opportunity arises to take advantage of the presence of terrorist groups, they will certainly not pass up that opportunity.
Yeah, the whole I talk also about all the mercenary movement in the world, how the private contract, what we call private contracts, with mercenaries, how these tortures are portrayed. They are portrayed by doctors that they are attached to the American army, or the mercenaries, because they are outside the Geneva Convention, etc., etc. That's basically what happened in Africa in the 60s, 70s, and in Spain as well. As who was the company in charge of the cameras when Julian Assange was in the Ecuadorian embassy? It was a defense company from Spain. So basically, it's mercenaries.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, perhaps we'll leave it there, but let's thank Francesc one more time for joining us today and for a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
And hopefully continuing these conversations a little more, because it seems like quite a few of us deal with these issues, not just in our research, but certainly in the classroom. So I'll echo what Felicia said earlier. I think it's really, really important to bring some of the pedagogical questions into our research.
Yes, crucial, yeah.
Okay, well, stay tuned for future past to present seminars. Probably in January will be the next one. But until then, hope everybody has a nice break, as much as that's possible. And take care.
Ciao.
Thanks. Okay, well, thanks again. That was awesome. That was really interesting.
It went well, or?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm glad. I mean, I think quite a few of us, we have a lot of historians who do, modern period colonialism. So we deal a lot with this issue at least in a secondary way. But I'm glad that Pam showed up too. I've had the same experience where I have students who say they take these classes, and I don't know who it's with exactly. So it was good that she came.
Yeah, I'm sure it has to be her. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll let you go, but I will send this recording to you.
Do you need me
and-
to send something else, like the presentation or something? I don't know.
I actually, I don't know what it includes in the recording. I think it should include.
Oh yeah,
your-
it should include it. Yeah, yeah. No, but I was
Yeah.
saying, like, well, you have my email for
Yeah.
whatever, if somebody has questions, because you mentioned that you were recording for people who couldn't attend.
Yeah, David Justice, he's a visiting professor in our department. He teaches US history, but I think also he may teach some modern Spain, sort of transnational. So I think he was interested. But yeah, well, if anything else, please keep in touch. And
I'll do.
hopefully once we're all back on campus sometime,
I would love to do that in general. I still don't know.
Yeah. Well, sounds good. Okay. Well, it's great meeting you. And
Yeah, same thing.
I'm sure I'll see you soon.
Yes.
All right. Take care.
Bye.